Okay, hopefully this is working. This is a backup version of the talk that I am about to give you, which hopefully I won't need. I've got myself there. I think I'll go up here and then I'll be the best out of the way. Okay, so thank you ever so much, everyone, for coming today. I'm really excited to be able to share this research with you, which I've been working on for quite a while. The questionnaire that I'm mainly going to talk about today ran last summer, and I know that many of the people in the audience participated in it, so thank you very much. I've actually been on research leave this semester, so I've been really immersed in this data for quite a few months. And with everything going on in the world, I was increasingly disappointed when every avenue at which I was going to share it with people was cancelled. So particular thanks to University of Kent for hosting this today. And I'm really thrilled that so many of you are here to listen to the findings. So here's just an overview of the talk. Perhaps that might be better over here. Here's just an overview of the talk. I'm not going to talk you through it. Because it's fairly self-explanatory, but this just sort of to give you a trajectory of what we're going to be looking at today. I think that the talk part of this is probably going to last about an hour, and if you're seeing this, it's probably because something has gone wrong with my internet, so hopefully I will have sorted it out by the time we get to questions, but I'd love to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, oh no, this is a terrible idea. Traversing of technology. Okay, right, we'll try down here. Okay, so I just want to start off with the disciplinary background that I have and the sort of perspective I'm coming at this data from. So I work in a field called Stylistics, which is a sub-discipline within linguistics. And very simply, stylistics is defined by Leach and Short here as the linguistic study of style and the way in which language is used. So stylisticians, we believe that all language, whether that is language that's written down in a literary text or in a newspaper or as a passing conversation, the words that I'm using right now, every tweet that you write, is made up of conscious and unconscious choices about linguistic features, which bits of language to use, which words to use and not use, the order in which to put them, the emphasis to give them, the context in which we decide it is or it isn't appropriate to swear are really good examples of linguistic, stylistic choices that we make. And stylisticians believe that using linguistic knowledge to unpick these styles is the best way to approach any kind of text. There is a focus within stylistics on the analysis of literary texts, and stylisticians don't see a separation between literature and language as two areas of English study in the way that it is carved up in places within the curriculum. We actually think that linguistic knowledge is the best tool that we can offer students to help them unpick and analyse any kind of text. In stylistics, there are really two key emphases. The first is on a common currency of terminology, so that we use terms, we're very clear about what those terms mean, and we engage them consistently throughout analysing any text. And the second is on textual evidence, so sort of showing what we're analysing, where we've got it from, and our sort of working out, if you will. I mention this because obviously there has been a huge influx in recent years into the curriculum of linguistic terminology, and lots of really legitimate questions about the way in which that has been characterised and framed. It's often taught, the tests are very sort of decontextualised often, but we see a real value in terminology when we're using it to talk about meaning and explain where we're getting interpretations from. Paul Simpson, professor at Liverpool, gives a great example of this in his book Stylistics, which is a great accessible book for students, as is this one displayed here, which was co-authored by me and Marcello Giovanelli, who I believe is in the audience as well. And he talks about being at a conference and hearing an author's work described as invertebrate. And for him, this is the perfect example of why being clear and consistent in our use of terminology is really important, because invertebrate could really mean anything. It could be a compliment or it could be an insult. You know, is the author's style, you know, flexible and dynamic, or is it flaccid? It's impossible to tell, and because it's impossible to tell, it's impossible to challenge. So we see a real value in consistent application and use of terminology, so that everybody knows what everybody's talking about and everybody can hold each other to account. Similarly, that's why we believe that textual evidence is really important, showing people where you're getting something from, and that if that person had shown a section of text and said that this is an example of an invertebrate style, and here are the 5 features of it, that would then be open to agreement or to falsifiability, to checking for accuracy and making things fundamentally testable. So hopefully those principles are reflected in the rest of the talk that I'm going to show you. In recent years, stylistics has taken what is commonly referred to as the cognitive turn, sort of around the early 2000s. And there's now a field within the school called cognitive stylistics, or sometimes called cognitive poetics. If you're interested in this, Peter Stockwell's new edition of cognitive poetics, which I am partially including here, apologies Peter, is a fantastic introductory guide that I would recommend as a fantastic CPD to anybody who is an English teacher and anybody who's interested in reading or analysis of text more generally. Essentially, cognitive poetics recognises the incredible value that work in cognitive science can potentially offer to people who are interested in understanding the process of reading, how people come to make interpretations, how people talk about texts, and this is something that I picked up recently in my 2019 book, Intertextuality in Practice, and this is how I see the distinction between the two. So where cognitive poetics takes its exploration of reading as an interaction between the text, more distally the author and the reader, a step further than stylistics, is in its recognition that narrative understanding, actually engaging with the text, and response, whether that's thinking about it at home on your own or sharing that response with other people, necessarily involves a central concern with what happens in the mind as we engage with and reflect on stories. As such, it posits that research on cognition offers a wealth of knowledge which is highly salient to understanding the behaviours and experiences of real readers. And it's that last bit, the behaviours and experiences of real readers, that I'm particularly interested in and I'm going to talk to you about in more detail today. So the area within this field that I particularly focus on is intertextuality, which when I published this book last year, I realised that you shouldn't assume that people know what it means, because many of my family members and friends didn't. Most people agree that intertextuality is somehow to do with connections between texts, whether that is connections that you perceive the author has made, making an allusion or a reference to another text in a literary work itself, or whether it is part and parcel of everyday conversation when we reference other texts, that those are intertextual references, they are acts of intertextuality. That is, however, pretty much all the field of intertextuality studies agrees on, and historically has been very, very focused on defining what counts as intertextuality. People like Bakhtin and Kristeva, who are often attributed as being kind of the architects of this area of study, essentially say that intertextuality is everything, that everything is somehow connected, a product of or feeding into something else. That is not in any way to malign or delegitimize that field of study, which I philosophically fully agree with. But as a linguist, when you're trying to then look at instances of intertextuality, those kinds of definitions become problematic, and those conversations are important but not particularly helpful in actualizing this into something that I can look in a text and then say, okay, how is intertextuality being used? How do people engage with it? So that's very much where my work has been situated. One of the products of that focus has been that there's been a lot of pretty much neglect of what I would call intertextuality in practice. So when people are making and encountering references to texts, whether that's in other works or in my particular interest when they're having conversations with other people, so we can call that book talk, literally talking about books, what happens? What goes on? What do people say? What do they do? How do they engage with these references? How do they make them? What happens when they come up and in conversation and another person doesn't recognize them? So these are all of the things that I'm really, really interested in. And in particular, I'm very fascinated by the gap between what readers think when they're talking about a book and what actually comes out of their mouth, what they actually say. And that is very much a sort of focus that led me onto this field of study. So this is a 50-word summary of what I've written into a full book here. But in practice, when you actually go and look at the discourse of readers out in the world, whether that is on online forums or in reading groups or in classrooms, what you find is that some people recognize certain references and other people don't. Some people see connections to stories they're familiar with, stories from their own personal histories, their memories, stories that friends or family might have told them, and some people don't. And these things can very much feed into people's framing of their sense of whether they enjoy a text, whether it speaks to them, whether they like it or not, and how they interpret it. You also find that some readers make and see connections and then they share them. And some people keep quiet about them, often in particular when it's to do with memories or personal experiences. People think these things are private, or they think that other people just wouldn't be interested in them, so they don't say anything at all. You also find that both readers and authors, when they make intertextual connections, sometimes are very, very specific and very explicit about the connection they're making. So they'll say something like, it's like that bit at the end of Lord of the Flies. And sometimes they're so vague, it's impossible to identify which text they're actually thinking about. So if I say, it's just like a Disney movie, you know what sort of text I'm referring to if you're familiar with Disney movies, but you have no way of knowing whether or not I'm actually thinking about Aladdin or Cinderella. Fantastic example we saw of this just this week on Twitter. This chap, Will Davies, offered this tweet about Captain Tom Moore, who's been doing laps of his garden to raise money for the NHS. Said, lovely tribute to Captain Tom Moore in the Yorkshire Dales, would love a retweet. Now, some of you will be laughing at this. I can't hear you, so I'm pretending you're all raucously laughing. And some of you will think, oh, what a lovely tribute. Alison Pearson clearly thought, what a lovely tribute. I'm sorry that I'm in the way. And retweeted it, just as he'd asked. This is, in fact, an image from the film, the 1973 film, The Wicker Man. And the reason that some people thought this was funny was because they recognised the intertextual reference there. Alison Pearson didn't. But what's particularly interesting about this is we can see that it's not just about whether or not somebody recognises something. There is some in-group and out-group work going on here. There is identity work going on here. And so we see these kinds of things all the time. And I think that cognitive poetics is a really valuable and productive way in which we can talk about this more systematically and more descriptively, identify what's going on in this gap between what people think and what they say, and how that can unfold in the course of a conversation. And these are the distinctions that I would make, which I'm not going to talk about because that is a different talk. But if you're interested, do go and have a look at the book. So at the same time, though, that all of this stuff is going on, certain people recognising things, other people not, there is a whole context that we need to consider around what I would call sort of the social minefield of book talk, of talking about books. So these are some of the claims that I would make based on the research that I've done. I think that talking about books and films and television shows is intrinsically bound up with our sense of identity. And I think this is true regardless of whether or not you think you are a reader or not a reader, whether you think you're a film buff or you're not really into that kind of stuff. Because in the world, we encounter talk about these things all the time, and we're faced with dealing with them when we do. So questions like, what's your favourite book, or have you read this, are not neutral questions. They're questions that actually can enforce and give people enjoyable sort of sensations that, oh yes, I do recognise this, and this makes me feel good because I think of myself as knowledgeable, or I think of myself as a reader, and I think well-educated people have read this. And it can equally make us feel stupid or a bit silly, as Alison Pearson probably felt. If we don't recognise these things, or if we like something and it becomes apparent that everybody else in a conversation doesn't. So because of this, people have many, many reasons to skew, to be a bit liberal with the truth, to misrepresent, or indeed actively lie about their narrative knowledge, what they have and haven't read, what they are and aren't familiar with, and also their preferences, what they do and don't like, what they read and enjoyed, what they read and thought was terrible. And this can obviously be completely contextually dependent. That's really important too. So depending on who's asking what our favourite book is, the answer might be different. Depending what kind of mindset we're in. If you've just been through a nasty breakup, probably The Notebook isn't your favourite film today, where it might have been a week ago. So in other words, the text that we talk about and what we say about them is a very socially loaded activity. And in an education context, I'm really interested in us understanding this better because, of course, whenever we study fiction or engage in talk about texts in a school or a university context, we are constantly asking teachers and students to interact about texts. So I think being mindful of this and being more knowledgeable about what goes on and the factors that influence it is really, really valuable for us to reflect on. And again, we can see this out in the world right at the moment with a proliferation of people being on Zoom calls and so on. This fantastic Twitter feed, if I do say so myself, has cropped up last month and already has nearly 50,000 followers, called Bookcase Credibility. And it's essentially an identification that lots and lots of people are going on places like BBC News and choosing where in their house to do their report from, and thus putting themselves in front of their bookshelves. And this sort of account has been offering a critique of the different bookshelves on display. Now, it's interesting to think about why it is that people choose to sit in front of their bookshelves. Is it a sort of a visual demonstration of all of the things they've read? Do we have a sense that it gives us some sort of gravitas to have lots of books in our house? And what does that mean for people who don't? So these were all kinds of questions that I was really interested in when I came to do this research. And these were the sorts of questions that, as I was starting to distill what I was really interested in, I wanted to focus on, and that fed into the talking about text research that I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. So I think that the more we want to understand about this, in particular, the thing that we need to focus on is the gap that happens between what goes on in someone's mind when they read, when they are thinking about a book, and when they're engaged with conversations or find themselves in conversations talking about text, and what actually comes out of their mouths. And these are the kinds of questions I was interested in. So when do readers, and indeed non-readers, share honestly about their knowledge and their preferences? Do people lie about what they have and haven't read, or is it just me? What about what they do and don't like? How often do they do this? Why do they do this? What role do emotions like embarrassment play in feeding into what we are and aren't willing to say? And what about fear of judgment? Things that we know can really acutely affect, for example, students in a school classroom. Whether the answer of that is, yes, I have read and enjoyed this, or no, I haven't. So I'm going to move on now and talk about the Talking About Texts project specifically. So if you clicked on this when I was spamming all of your Twitter feeds last summer, and thank you very much again for doing so, this is what you will have found as the initial information page. So talking about text, exploring reading and identity. This questionnaire will ask you questions about your feelings about reading and about your experiences of talking about books with other people. It's part of a research project that's looking at how we think about our reading habits in relation to our identity. And I just had a stipulation that I added based on piloting this, where my pilot participants weren't sure, which that by reading we mean physical books, ebooks, and audiobooks. So I'm not obviously going to have time to talk through the entire survey today, but here's just a sample of some of the questions that it asked and that I'm going to talk about today. So things like, have you ever read and enjoyed a book that you would be reluctant to tell others about? Are there any circumstances in which you might lie about reading a book you hadn't read? And do you ever feel embarrassed about books that you haven't read? So 653 people participated, and that yielded 644 valid responses. So there were a couple where people didn't answer all of the consent questions and I had to remove them. Crucially, for me, from a methodology point of view, the survey was completely anonymous, and that was very much on purpose, because I'm very conscious that when you're asking people questions about their identity, and in particular things that might be threatening to their identity, if their identity is also on display, that's going to affect whether or not they want to answer those questions. So I asked them only for 3 bits of identifying information. I didn't ask for age, ethnic backgrounds, gender, anything like that. And because I think that anonymity is not just whether or not somebody knows your name. I think anonymity is also a thing that we feel. And if people feel identifiable, or they feel that, you know, the kind of person they are by characteristics that's just not necessary to ask or on display, that too can sort of influence their answers. So I only asked them for 3 bits of information that I thought were really crucial to knowing who these participants are. And I'm going to talk you through these, through the demographics of these now. Just before I move on, I've left in the numbers of the questions just so you can see sort of structurally where they were in the research questionnaire. The first 5 questions were just consent questions. So the second actual question that people were asked was, would you call yourself a reader? And these last 2 questions were after they had answered all other substantive questions. So, would you call yourself a reader? I was obviously anticipating that in a survey that I was disseminating on Twitter, which I mainly use to talk about English education and books, that the majority of people would say yes. And also, obviously, as a natural byproduct of it being a survey about reading, I suspected that more people would be interested in answering the survey. I wasn't necessarily expecting the proportion to be this high, and I think that merits reflection. First of all, because I think it potentially says something quite important about who identifies conversations about books and reading as being for them or not for them, and also because I think it informs the responses that then follow. So you can see a couple of the tweets that I used to disseminate the survey, and it's perfectly possible, I think, that the phrasing of these may have been either appealing to people who do identify as readers or off-putting to people who don't. So that might be one explanation. This does seem high. 63% of the UK population, according to our best national statistics, read for pleasure, but that definition includes anybody who's read a book for enjoyment in the past year, so just one. It might be that the first substantive question, so question 6, that just immediately preceded this, might have been off-putting to people who don't identify as readers, and they may have then clicked off the survey, which I wouldn't be able to tell. That question was, what's your favourite book? And said you can list up to 3. That was supposed to be a sort of low-stakes way of focusing participants' attention on thinking about their reading and their behaviours and their practices and their likes and dislikes and so on. But in retrospect, might have been off-putting because it encodes an assumption that you have a favourite book and therefore perhaps that you are a reader. As I've already said, it might be to do with where it was disseminated and who it was disseminated to. So even though it was completely open and said anybody can participate, naturally, as a result of the people it was in front of, that might have been what influenced it. Thinking about students, though, in particular, and in particular GCSE and younger students who have not necessarily chosen to be in an English literature classroom, I do think that there is a potential here that what if that there's something here that says that surveys about reading aren't for me if I'm not a reader. Is answering these kinds of questions more identity threatening to people who self-identify as I'm not a reader? That might be something that could inform that too. The next question I asked was roughly how many books do you read in an average year? And again, I think the findings here are quite stark and quite surprising. So we can see that about 40% of people read more than 25 books a year, and approximately, I think it's about 2/3, just over half, read 16 or more. Again, this seems pretty high. So the Nielsen Book Research Scheme, what the national statistics use, claimed that only 10% of UK adults, though of course the survey might have included people from all sorts of other countries because I didn't ask, so I don't know, but only 10% of adults are classified as heavy readers. And that uses book purchasing as its metric to work that out. So if you buy more than 16 books a year, you're considered a heavy reader. So it's a slightly different metric than I was asking for. But again, this seems sort of remarkably disproportionate. Again, this might have just been to do with the product of the survey dissemination. It might be that participating is more appealing to prolific readers and less appealing to people who read less. It might be that there's some generous counting going on. So if people are reading Room with a Broom and 10 Beatrix Potters to their kids in the evening, and they're counting those, that perhaps that accounts for those sorts of numbers. And it could be, of course, that a proportion of the participants aren't being truthful or entirely truthful about how many books they read. But I do have some data on this. So one of the very last questions that people were asked was, reflecting on your answers, are there any responses where you haven't been entirely honest or felt a temptation to lie? Now, for the researchers in particular in the audience, I think that this finding is really merits some serious reflection, because I would suggest that in a context where everything is geared for people feeling like they can be open and honest, still 88% of the participants answered yes to this. What's even more interesting is the follow-up question, where I asked, if people would be willing to elaborate on this answer, and these are the sorts of things that you see. So I think that methodologically, in particular for reader response studies, that this raises real questions about, in contexts where people aren't anonymous, because they're at a book group, for example, because they're in a classroom, how far are we taking account of these sorts of identity pressures, of the knowledge that you're being observed, that people here are talking about the anonymity being the thing that has prompted them not to lie. And I think participant 388 puts it very nicely. As this is an anonymous, I don't mind sharing. I don't think I'd have answered the same if directly questioned. So just an interesting thing to kind of observe and reflect on in terms of how we go about researching reading there. This chart is a cross-reference of the people who said yes, no, or it depends to the earlier question, would you call yourself a reader, cross-referenced with how many books those people then reported that they read a year. And again, I just want to pause briefly on this because I think it's really interesting. I think it could be quite easy to assume that people who don't think of themselves as readers don't read or read very little, and people who count themselves as readers read more. And in very crude terms, you can see that there is that sort of split. But interestingly, the it depends people are distributed right across. There are 7 people who read more than 25 books a year who still said it depends. And we've got some people who read quite a few books a year and still don't think of themselves as readers. So where this determination comes from is clearly not just down to how much quantity of how much we read. Last but not least, before I move on to the actual responses themselves, I just want to talk about the last question asked, which was, how would you best describe your job or profession? This can be a current and previous role. So I offered this as an open response to participants, rather than, for example, a drop-down menu where you could select the thing that best fit. Because this is a survey about identity, and I thought it was important that people were able to express that identity how they wanted. So if you're a student and you have a part-time job at Tesco's, with this you can put both of those things, or you can choose which one you put, and I've used that as the way I've then coded these categories of where people fell as a result. So the big thing that I want to highlight again, because I think it really informs the rest of the data and the responses and what we need to be mindful of, is roughly 2/3, possibly even slightly more, of the participants have some sort of role in education, and just under half of them identified themselves as teachers. So when we're talking about these questions that I'm going to show you in a moment about, do people feel embarrassed about books they haven't read, would they lie, and so on and so on. These are the people who we're talking about. And in many senses, I think the people who you might suspect would be least likely to lie. They tend to have read a lot. Most of them identify as readers, and many of them work in education, and a lot of these teachers also identified as English teachers as well. Conversely, we might say these people are the people who have the most, from an identity point of view, to lose by being revealed to have not read a book that somebody else thinks that they should have done. I'd be really interested in your reflections on that at the end. So 644 participants generated approximately 87,000 words of data, but a proportion of this is not narrative responses. So a lot of that is yeses and nos. So the actual size of data that we're looking at in terms of the kind of content responses is smaller than this. There is a combination of qualitative and quantitative data, and I haven't got onto doing any statistical analysis yet, so I can't tell you anything at the moment about significant differences between groups and so on, but it's something that I'm hoping to do at a later date. The analysis I've performed using a combination of traditional coding and thematic analysis, so literally going through multiple times through the data and identifying patterns and themes and noting things that are consistent, but also using corpus analysis, which if anyone doesn't know what that is, I'm going to talk about it a bit more in a moment, as a way of sort of scaling up and making slightly more robust and systematic that qualitative approach. Also, stylistic analysis, though this is in the early stages, so I'm not just interested in what participants have said, but the way in which they've said it and how they've chosen to express themselves, whether that was conscious or unconscious. If you're a teacher and you're interested in corpus software, this is something that there are lots of resources that you can use with your students in your classroom. And Click Dickens, I'll just hover over, this is a hyperlink, but I don't think it'll work for you, but you can see the thing there. What corpus software basically is a bit of software that allows us to search very large amounts of text very quickly. Click Dickens is something where it uses it where, for example, if you wanted to look up the word Oliver in Oliver Twist, it would tell you how many instances of Oliver there are, and you could use what's called a concordance, which you can on the real website click on just there, and it will show you every instance of Oliver, and you can either sort that chronologically as it appears in the text, or alphabetically by the words that precede or follow it, and I'll show you some examples of that as we go through. It's a really fantastic resource and something I would really advocate for having a look at. In particular, perhaps in this kind of context where we've been forced into an online context for teaching, can be something that can be really productive for students to investigate. So just before I move on to the specific questions that I've discussed in the survey, here are the prevalent authors, genres and texts that came up across the responses. So most of these were ones that I just sort of noticed as I was doing the analysis and going through and coding the data that came up again and again. But I've then been through the corpus software and used that software to check how many instances there are of these terms. You can see that they do reoccur, some with quite a startling amount of frequency. Here's just to organise them another way. What's really fascinating about this, I think, is that we can see that there are genres that consistently come up, and I'll mention. So when you ask people questions about reading and identity, these are the sorts of things they talk about. These are the sorts of authors that they talk about, and these are the specific titles. Harry Potter, in particular, was a keyword, so it was unusually frequent across the entire data set, and I have actually checked that for, regardless of how many books people read a year, it's still an unusually frequent word, and regardless of what profession they're in, it's still unusually frequent. So I think that's quite interesting too. One thing that I noticed straight away is the prominence that's afforded to either the text or the author when people are discussing these things in relation to their reading and their identity, and in particular in relation to things like embarrassment and whether or not they would lie. So for example, there are 70 instances of Harry Potter, but only 4 of Rowling. So it's the book in this case that is being foregrounded as the thing that's important. Similarly, 50 Shades of Grey, which is probably not a surprise to anybody, has appeared in a survey about books you've read that you'd be reluctant to tell people you enjoyed. There's 19 instances of the title and absolutely none of the author. Things like Ulysses and War and Peace, which are very often talked about in the data as being these sort of iconic things that people feel like they're supposed to have read and actually almost nobody has, have a bit more of a split, tending towards the book, but also sometimes mentioning the author. And then by contrast, we can see other iterations of this. So Georgette Heyer gets mentioned 8 times. She gets full named 8 times. She gets used by her surname just once, and there are no references to any specific titles. Equally, just an interesting sort of observation, some authors get full named and some don't. So Jane Austen tends to get full named and Charles Dickens tends not to. I'd be really interested if anyone has any sort of theories as to what might be informing that. And in both cases, there were far fewer specific titles, though from a corpus perspective, that's slightly harder to search. So there's a little bit of a caveat with that last bit of the sentence there. So here's what people said when they were asked, are there any circumstances in which you might lie about reading a book you hadn't read? 38.6% of people said yes, 60% of people said no, and 9 of them were so undecided in what they wrote that it was impossible to determine whether or not they were saying yes or saying no. Now, that to me was quite surprising. I certainly have circumstances in which I would lie about reading a book I hadn't read. It's a bit of an occupational hazard of working in this field. But actually, once you start to drill down into what people say and how they qualify the responses, in particular looking at the people who say no, they wouldn't lie, there are 3 themes that emerge that I think are really fascinating. So first of all, and I'll show you some examples of this on the next slide, there are lots of distinctions that people make between active lying or actually lying and passive lying, that they don't always classify as counting. And there is interestingly some disparity between some participants who describe exactly the same sort of behaviour, things like nodding along or being evasive, that some people have classified as saying, so yes, that means I do lie, and some people saying, so no, I don't. Lots of people who say no qualify this with a statement of something like, not anymore, or now I'm older, I don't care, or I did do this, or I would have done this when I was younger. Again, a really valuable insight, I think, into comparing how many of us may feel as adults, and particularly if we work in fields of education, compared to how students might feel, who are those younger iterations of ourselves and perhaps less confident. And interestingly, many people said they wouldn't lie, but the reason they wouldn't lie is because they were worried about getting caught. So here, I'm not going to read through these, but I'll just give you a moment to have a look through some of those responses. Okay, so these are the sorts of strategies that people who wouldn't consider themselves as liars, and actually some who would, but these are the kinds of strategies that people engage with to avoid actually lying. Either, you know, valuable information for catching people out at your next book club, but also I would hope a productive thing to think about in terms of when we have contexts where we're trying to encourage people to talk about texts honestly, that these might be some of the behaviours that you could potentially look for. The next really important question, and again, sort of with my education hat on, I think is really useful to understand, is why people might lie, whether or not that's their active or passive iteration of lying. And again, I'll just give you a moment to have a look through these. Okay, these are obviously just a very small snapshot of the data, but in both cases, the ones I've shown you, I've tried to pick ones that are sort of representative of what people say more broadly. Here are the findings of the one of the later questions. Do you ever feel embarrassed about books you haven't read? A bit more of an even split here. So 54% of people said no, but 45% of people said yes. And I think in particular, considering the demographics I've shown you earlier about almost half of this sample reading more than 25 books a year, and nearly everybody identifying as a reader, and 2/3 of people being involved in education, this is really fascinating to me, and I would suspect would probably be quite a lot higher in other areas of the population. So once they'd answered that question for that sort of raw kind of quantitative determination, I then had a look through and coded the responses to the next question. Could you say a bit more about this? And these are the patterns that emerged. So for people who said yes, they do feel embarrassed about books they haven't read, these are the common things, that explanations that they included. That they feel this way around particular people, so very notably colleagues, and I must say, though the higher representation of teachers would make you sort of naturally expect this because there are more teachers in the survey, but other teachers and in the staff room were particular places where people were likely to say that they felt this way. Really interesting and repeated invocation of the metaphor of gaps in their reading. So people conceptualizing sort of a reading history as an object that should be whole, and that they had gaps and that these gaps were bad or problematic in some way. It was very, very common. And this last one, expectations and assumptions about them, which normally related to their job, made them feel this way. Other sort of identities or aspects of identity that were being invoked as well, but professional identity, very, very, very prevalent. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. For the participants who said no, these were the four main elaborations that they offered, that again, that maybe they would have felt about like this when they were younger, which I think is a valuable thing to bear in mind when thinking about whether students would be more or less likely to think about this, about I'm too old to care, I don't care anymore. A really interesting, and I haven't been able to look at this statistically yet, but I suspect that this is particularly prevalent among the people who report reading more books in a year, is this sort of suggestion that I read lots. So there's a certain point at which you are kind of inoculated against feeling embarrassed about this, because you've read enough that if you've got gaps, that it doesn't matter, because they're sort of incidental gaps. They're not gaps that are a reflection on you and how much you read more generally, because it's impossible to read everything, which of course is true. Then also really interesting, like things like why should I, or reading as a personal choice. A much smaller proportion of people, but people who just seem to not be able to understand why anybody would feel this way. Equally, I think one person answered, what a bizarre question. And I saw similar responses like this in the question about lying. So a really small number of people who, it clearly just has never crossed their mind that this might be a way that other people might feel, which is an interesting insight as well. So the last bit of the talk, I'm just going to focus on this last bit about expectations and assumptions typically relating to a job, because I am very interested in English teachers in particular, and this was a really, really prevalent pattern that I noticed straight away whilst I was going through the data sort of manually, and the corpus searches confirmed this very strongly. So there are 38 instances of the adverbial phrase as an English teacher, so sort of invoking, adopting, or speaking from this particular professional identity. This is what a concordance looks like, by the way. So this is just looking for the phrase as an English as a teacher, and then I've let it search things so you can see that one that says a male teacher in the middle, but 38 of these are actually just as an English teacher. And what you can see if you start to look through the co-text, the things that are surrounding this adverbial phrase, is a sense of things that I should have read, that I'm expected to read, that either I lie, or I feel embarrassed, or I feel judged, because as an English teacher, the expectation is that you've read lots and lots of stuff. And very commonly, this is to do with the classics. Also young adult and YA fiction, and sometimes just talking about reading lots, but probably most commonly talking about the classics. I think it's particularly interesting that this is an adverbial phrase, because adverbials aren't necessary syntactically for a sentence to make sense. You can lift them out and remove them, or move them around a sentence however you like. So these are sort of qualifications that these participants have felt necessary to add, or that they merit this kind of qualification. It's sort of invocation of this particular identity, which I think is really fascinating. And you can see that there are instances of as a teacher as well. Now, of course, these may also be English teachers. I don't know. There certainly are teachers of other subjects in the data set. but this other iteration appears. There are another 12 instances of this as well. Now, I think that this says something quite powerful about English still being very strongly conceptualized as English is literature, as opposed to, for example, English is language, English is media, English is drama. And this is a sort of a sense that exists in the world that seems to weigh heavily and powerfully on teachers. And it makes me wonder about English teachers whose background isn't in literature, or who don't really like reading, or who don't get a chance to read a lot because they're doing 18,000 other things at a time, and where that leaves them. I also wonder if English teachers feel this way. Is this a conceptualization that we are passing on to students, that they are understanding that what it means to be good at English is to read prolifically, and to read and enjoy the classics specifically? And there is a really interesting subset of people in this, people from other cultures or different cultural, additional cultural backgrounds, who talk about, I'm not familiar with the classics because I grew up in Portugal, or I'm from an Asian heritage and we read different books, but these sort of don't count within this thing, and so therefore I feel this embarrassment, I feel this guilt, and what that sort of potentially is perpetuating, that might merit reflection as well. So the very last thing I'm going to show you is just another nifty thing that you can do with corpus analysis, which is called collocate analysis. So collocates are words that appear close to other words. So classics is something which is talked about very prevalently throughout the data set. And when you pop it into this bit of corpus software and you look for the words that are unusually frequent appearing near classics, the second one is should, the modal auxiliary should. A sort of sense that, when we talk about that we should do things, there's a sense of some sort of, it's called deontic modality, a sort of external pressure that I should have done this or I shouldn't have done that, that is bad, that if I haven't, it's some sort of deficiency in a way. And I just want to finish by just showing you this remarkable consistency of what this looks like in practice of what people say. And you can see that there is a very resounding sense, and I would say that this is common throughout the data set, of people feeling like they should have read more of the classics. And in the context where we have a curriculum that is increasingly pushing towards the classics as the sort of main diet of English literature, particularly at GCSE, I do wonder where this feeling has come from, whether it existed before, whether it is being intensified by curriculum changes, and what that really means if we all feel like we should have read more of the classics and secretly haven't done so. So just to conclude then, I'm going to just leave these up, and hopefully if you're watching this version, I will have reappeared to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you ever so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.